Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn d4 takes c5. Pawn e7 to e6. Knight b1 to c3. Knight b8 to a6. Knight c3 to e4. Pawn f7 to f5. Knight e4 to d6, check. Bishop f8 takes d6. Pawn c5 takes d6. Knight a6 to b4. Bishop c1 to d2. Queen d8 to a5. Pawn a2 to a3. Knight b4 takes c2, check. Queen d1 takes c2. Queen a5 to e5. Bishop d2 to c3. Queen e5 to e4. Queen c2 takes e4. Pawn f5 takes e4. Bishop c3 takes g7. Pawn e4 to e3. Pawn f2 takes e3. Knight g8 to f6. Bishop g7 takes h8. Knight f6 to e4. Bishop h8 to e5. Pawn h7 to h5. Knight g1 to f3. Pawn b7 to b5. Knight f3 to d4. Pawn a7 to a6. Rook a1 to c1. Bishop c8 to b7. Rook c1 to c7. Rook a8 to a7. Pawn b2 to b3. King e8 to d8. Rook h1 to g1. King d8 to e8. Rook g1 to h1. King e8 to d8. Rook h1 to g1. King d8 to e8. Pawn g2 to g4. Pawn h5 takes g4. Rook g1 takes g4. King e8 to d8. Rook g4 to g8, checkmate.